Hey everyone! In honor of Black History Month in the United States, we'll be exploring the lives of various African American historical figures who you might not have heard about. Their lives were fascinating and range from shocking to inspiring, but they are for the most part overlooked today. Join me as we explore their forgotten lives. For our first story, we are going back to late 17th century Philadelphia. Alice of Dunk's Ferry, also known as Old Alice and Black Alice, was born enslaved in the recently founded town of Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, in the middle colonies of British North America around 1686. Her parents were slaves who had been brought to America from Barbados in the Caribbean. Whether they were born there or had been born in Africa and brought as slaves across the Atlantic early in their lives is unclear. Alice was born just a few years after the establishment of Philadelphia in 1682, and she later recollected that she remembered growing up there at a time when the surrounding region was, quote, a wilderness, and when the Indians, its chief inhabitants, hunted wild game in the woods, while the panther, the wolf, and the beasts of the forest were prowling about the wigwams and the cabins in which they lived. It must be said that Alice was amongst the unlucky few in Pennsylvania, which was not a major slave-owning state. Slavery had developed gradually across the British colonies of North America in the 17th century, with it beginning in the late 1610s and 1620s as a form of indentured servitude, where Africans were brought in and forced to work for several years, but at the end of which they were often released and given their own plot of land on the edges of the colonies. A similar arrangement pertained for the Irish in colonies like Virginia, where many struggled through tenures as indentured servants for many years. However, in the case of Africans being brought to North America, their circumstances got worse over time, and by the end of the 17th century when Alice was born, laws had been introduced to effectively create the kind of chattel and plantation slavery that is synonymous with America's early history. The situation, though, was different in Pennsylvania. This colony had been established in the early 1680s by William Penn, an English Quaker who had received land from King Charles II of England in compensation for a considerable debt owed by the crown to his deceased father. Over the next quarter of a century, William developed Philadelphia and the surrounding region as a haven for religious dissenters such as Quakers, Baptists and Moravians, who faced persecution back in Europe. This spirit of tolerance also extended to enslaved people, and in time the Quakers became the driving force behind the abolitionist movement in the colonies and in Britain, with William Wilberforce, the head of the abolitionist movement in England, being a Quaker himself. What this ensured was that Pennsylvania had a relatively small number of enslaved people by comparison with the colonies further to the south, such as Virginia and the Carolinas, while the 5,000 or 6,000 slaves which were in Pennsylvania were generally treated better than their counterparts working on the tobacco and cotton plantations of the South. All of this impacted on Alice's life, and as we will see very shortly, her experiences were tied up with those figures like William Penn in her youth. When she was 10 years of age, Alice was taken from Philadelphia and sent to Dunk's Ferry. This was located not far from Philadelphia, on the site of what is now Neshaminy State Park in Bucks County in Philadelphia. From here one can clearly make out the skyline of Philadelphia today, and so Alice had not been taken far from the growing town. The reason for her relocation was to act as a ferry master at Dunk's, where a ferry had been established to convey travellers across the Delaware River in 1695. Here she was enslaved by Samuel Carpenter, and was employed to collect the toll money which people who wished to travel on the ferry were required to pay for transport across the river. She would spend the next 40 years working at Dunk's Ferry. The reason we know a good amount about Alice's life is primarily because her story was related just after her death by Isaiah Thomas. He was the founder of the American Antiquarian Society in 1812 and a newspaperman and writer. He also has the interesting distinction of having read out the Declaration of Independence for the first time in Massachusetts in 1776, after it had been ratified by the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. In 1804, Thomas published a book entitled Eccentric Biography or Memoirs of Remarkable Female Characters, Ancient and Modern, etc., with portraits. This was a collection of nearly 100 short biographies of interesting female figures, many of them being 18th century rulers and noblewomen like Catherine the Great of Russia and the philosopher and early feminist Mary Astle. Yet, the very first entry in Thomas's book was for Alice of Dunk's Ferry, and Thomas, who had talked to people who knew Alice in her later years, provides an invaluable account of her. It is from Thomas that we learn that Alice knew many of the key figures of Pennsylvania's early history, noting that she remembered William Penn, the proprietor of Pennsylvania, Thomas Story, James Logan, and several other prominent characters of that day. Penn, as mentioned, was the founder of the colony, and remained in charge down to his death in 1718, following which his family took over. Thomas Story was a prominent and controversial Quaker who, after spending time in Pennsylvania, returned to Europe, and was arrested on several occasions for preaching his religious beliefs in England and Ireland. Logan was a Scots-Irishman who later became mayor of Philadelphia. In 1737 he signed the walking purchase with the local Lenape Indians, which allowed for the westward expansion of the Pennsylvania colony. Finally, Alice's enslaver at Dunk's Ferry, Samuel Carpenter, was a lifelong friend of William Penn's, and was the first treasurer of the Pennsylvania colony. Curiously, he was regularly on record as having protested against the institution of slavery, but this clearly conflicts with his ownership of Alice. What it does suggest is that the circumstances of her slavery would perhaps have been less oppressive than those of her counterparts further to the south in the plantations. Beyond these figures, Alice, who lived to be well over 100, also lived through momentous events in American life. These included the 7 Years' War with the French and the Native American allies between 1756 and 1763, followed by the American Revolution in the 1770s, the birth of the United States, and the early history of the country. As such, she had much of interest to relate to people later in her life. Luckily, Alice was more than happy to recount the things she had seen and the people she had known, and this has led to her becoming known as one of the first oral historians of America. During the decades she worked at Dunk's Ferry, she was known to converse with waiting passengers about the history of Pennsylvania, and regaled them with stories about William Penn and his associates in the early history of the colony. Alice was illiterate, and so could not read or write down her recollections of Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, yet she was known to have an excellent memory and be extremely intelligent. For instance, later in her life, when she was very old, even by modern standards, she was, as related by Isaiah Thomas, able to point out how Philadelphia had changed as a city when visiting it, showing people where the church and other buildings had stood nearly a century earlier, and what was gone and what remained from its early days. Few questioned the veracity of her accounts, and she was known for living a very honest and moderate life. Evidently, from how Thomas writes about her, Alice had become something of a feature of Pennsylvania life by the late 18th century, with people far and wide travelling to hear her incredibly detailed and rich accounts of the early colony. Alice did not live out all of her long life enslaved. After 40 years of working at Dunk's Ferry, by which time she was probably in her early 50s, she was released from working there. It is unclear if this means that she was given her freedom, or if she was simply allowed to retire. Whichever the case, it appears that her conditions after 1740 or so were generally those of a free woman, while in 1780, Pennsylvania followed Vermont's lead and became the second part of the emerging United States to abolish slavery. Hence, Alice would have died a free woman. She lived a long life in retirement, eventually living to be an estimated 116 years, a longevity which appears to be accurate, given the substantiated reports that she was in Pennsylvania in the early years of the colony and knew William Penn, a man who had died in 1718. Her later life was spent as an oral historian, and also engaged in various other pursuits. She was extremely religious, having others read the Bible to her, and attending church on horseback when she was allegedly in her 90s. She was also a keen fisher, often rowing out into the middle of the Delaware River, even in her old age to fish, and seldom returning without a decent catch. Alice even appears to have established a business selling salted fish or shad in later life. As she aged, her health inevitably deteriorated. In the 1780s, her eyesight began to fail her, and she eventually went blind. Isaiah Thomas's assertion that her sight miraculously returned at 102 years of age seems more than a little dubious. He also reported that, before she died, her hair became perfectly white, and the last of her teeth dropped sound from her head aged 116 years. Despite her growing infirmity, she was known to visit Philadelphia from time to time, though she lived her later years at Bristol in Pennsylvania, to the northeast of Philadelphia, along the Delaware River. She died there on some unknown date in 1802, with estimates placing her at 116. If this is true, this would put her inside the top 30 oldest people to have ever lived, and she was likely the oldest person in the world at the time. Today, her story is being reassembled from various archives, and a plaque has been erected at Dunk's Ferry to recognise that the river crossing that Alice attended to for over 4 decades once stood there. Next, we are heading to the American Northwest, where George Washington's alleged wet nurse was touring during the 1830s. In the autumn and early winter of 1835, a woman by the name of Joyce Heth was the talk of New England and New York. Heth was the centerpiece of an exhibit being taken around Massachusetts, Connecticut and other states, run by one Phineas Taylor Barnum, a man in his mid-20s, then largely unknown to the world, but soon to become revered as P.T. Barnum, the greatest showman on earth. Barnum's show in 1835 was a modest affair from the theatres and circuses he would run in later years. In this early venture, he had only one exhibit, an old woman by the name of Joyce Heth. That might not sound all that interesting, but Heth was apparently very old. In fact, Heth was so old that she claimed that she'd been the wet nurse for George Washington, the great hero of the American Revolutionary War and the first President of the United States. Those who came to visit Heth in New England that autumn and early winter, or who had seen her debut at Nibbles Garden in New York City a few weeks earlier, were fascinated by her stories about little Georgie and how she raised him in Virginia a century earlier. To put this into perspective, George Washington was born in Virginia in the spring of 1732, 103 years before Barnum began exhibiting Heth. Given that wet nurses were generally women aged between 20 and 40, if Barnum's claims were to be believed, then Heth would have needed to have been over 120 years of age at least. Yet, for whatever reason, Barnum exaggerated things further by stating that she was born in 1674 and was 161 years old. This was a slightly bizarre statement, given that this would have made her a woman in her late 50s when acting as Washington's wet nurse. Perhaps Barnum thought the number would attract a bigger audience. In any case, it certainly made many doubt his claims. Heth soon became a sensation, billed as the most astonishing and interesting curiosity in the world, one who had been a slave under Augustine Washington, George's father, and who had been the carer for the founding father through the 1730s and into the 1740s. And for a time Barnum made a lot of money and garnered a lot of press attention by exhibiting her. But it was short-lived. On the 19th of February 1836, after just a few months of media sensation, Heth died in New York City. Heth's passing led to an event which somewhat paradoxically proved that Barnum had been lying about her background, but at the same time would propel his career as a showman forward. With the aged wet nurse lying dead, Barnum decided to try and capitalize on the notoriety she'd acquired over the previous year. Accordingly, he hired a doctor by the name of David L. Rogers to perform an autopsy on her body to verify that she was indeed well over a century old. However, Rogers did not confirm Barnum's outlandish claims. Instead, he asserted that she was a woman in her late 70s or early 80s, and not the unusual centenarian that Barnum had claimed. While the autopsy and the public attention which it garnered could have ruined Barnum, he was a man who understood the idea that there is no such thing as bad publicity. He had already drawn up public interest by charging some 1,500 punters $50, a significant enough sum at the time to attend the autopsy on the 19th of February 1836. Even in its aftermath, he continued to generate public interest, spreading outlandish stories that Rogers had actually carried out the autopsy on a completely different person, and that Heth was alive and well and touring in Europe. The penny newspapers couldn't get enough of it, and as we will see, it helped to launch Barnum's career. But the sad reality is that Joyce Heth was dead. Her autopsy had revealed that she was most likely born sometime in the 1750s, when Washington was entering his adult years. So, if Joyce Heth was not who Barnum said she was, who was she? The reality is that we know very little about the real Joyce Heth, but there is enough available evidence to piece together a few broad details of her life. She was apparently born sometime in the 1750s. Her place of birth is unknown, though we can almost certainly dismiss the claim made at the time that she hailed from the island of Madagascar off the coast of East Africa. Instead, it seems more likely that she came from a slave family in one of the southern states, with Virginia, the Carolinas or Georgia being the most likely place given her time of birth, though there is no record of any kind to tie her to the Washington estate at Mount Vernon. The first major records concerning her do not appear until she was quite elderly, when she was enslaved in Kentucky. Early in 1835, Barnum received a tip concerning her from a Kentucky showman by the name of R.W. Lindsay. He subsequently went to visit her and found a very old woman who was totally blind, had thick grey hair, a small frame, fingernails that resembled talons, and an aged, wrinkled face. But what was most curious was that Heth, who was almost certainly suffering from advanced senility and memory loss, was extremely talkative and liked to entertain her guests with tales about looking after her dear little Georgie. Who Georgie was remains open to debate, but Barnum quickly organised to rent Heth, as it was illegal for him to have bought a slave in the free northern states by the mid-1830s. He also drew up a fake bill of sale allegedly dating from the 18th century, one which connected her to the Washington family. With that, Barnum set off to New York to exhibit what he termed George Washington's nursing mammy. When we examine the events of 1835, taking into account who Joyce Heth actually was, it becomes all too clear how vile Barnum's behaviour was in trying to present her to the world as George Washington's 161-year-old wet nurse. Not only was he taking this vulnerable, enslaved elderly lady and presenting her as an attraction to make money, but he also overworked her extensively. At the height of her popularity in 1835, Barnum exhibited this blind 80-year-old 6 days a week for over 12 hours a day. People could shake her hand, take her pulse, and touch her so long as it was appropriate, treating her somewhat like an animal. This went on for about 7 or 8 months, and he pocketed all of the profits, which are believed to have amounted to over $1,500, a handsome sum of money at the time, equivalent to around $50,000 today. Barnum was also bending the slave ownership rules of the time by, quote, renting Heth from her Kentucky owner, a state where slavery was still in force, and taking her to the free states of the North, where slavery was illegal. But for all intents and purposes, he had purchased her and was illegally travelling around New York and New England with a slave. There were rumours of further abuse. For instance, one story holds that Barnum got Heth drunk and had her remaining teeth taken out in order to make her look like a more authentic 161-year-old, whatever a 161-year-old should look like. It's unclear if this story is true or not, and it's possible Heth was missing all of her teeth when he first met her, but the very fact that such a story could develop is indicative of the manner in which Barnum effectively abused this elderly woman who couldn't even take care of herself. Also, many blame Barnum for Heth's death, pointing out that she had grown weak from her grueling schedule, leading her to an early grave. As cruel as Barnum's conduct might have been in his treatment of Joyce Heth, there is no doubting that the whole episode served to launch his career. Shortly after the Heth autopsy, he set up Barnum's Grand Scientific and Musical Theatre. It met with mixed success owing to the Panic of 1837, a financial crash which led to economic stagnation in the late 1830s. But once people had money back in their pockets in the early 1840s, they came in large numbers to Barnum's latest venture, Scudder's American Museum, a venue where Barnum exhibited all manner of people with what were deemed to be physical abnormalities at the time: dwarves, albinos, those with giantism, and other conditions. It was the beginning of a long career in which the man who became known as the greatest showman on earth and founded the Barnum and Bailey Circus would largely make his riches by exploiting the unfortunate, people like Joyce Heth, with whom it all started back in the mid-1830s. Curiously, Barnum's reputation is often still bolstered today, notably through the 2017 film The Greatest Showman, which completely overlooked the unsavoury elements of his life, career and character. Joyce Heth was buried after the autopsy in Barnum's hometown of Bethel, Connecticut. He claimed this was done with respect, but this ignores all of his actions up to that point. In later years, Barnum emerged as a staunch abolitionist, and his exploitation of Heth became a major source of embarrassment. He briefly wrote about this in his 1869 memoir, expressing that the least deserving of all of my efforts in the show line was the one which introduced me to the business. He adds that it was a scheme in no sense of my own devising, one which had been some time before the public and which had so many vouchers for its genuineness that at the time of taking possession of it, I honestly believed it to be genuine. Barnum largely downplays the tour with Heth and avoids going into details on the autopsy, simply referring to it as a dark subject that is shrouded in mystery. Today though, her memory has been reclaimed from being something other than just an oddity that Barnum used to build his career. In particular, the scholarship of Harriet A. Washington in her book Medical Apartheid, which highlighted the manner in which medical experimentation on African Americans remained a phenomenon in 19th century America, even as slavery was coming to an end, and the work of Benjamin Rees on race relations in the 19th century entertainment industry in the United States, have highlighted the manner in which Heth was victimized by a man who is all too often celebrated as the greatest showman of the age. This third story is quite tragic but truly inspiring. This enslaved woman defied all odds and became an influential abolitionist, an activist for African American civil rights and women's rights. Named Isabella Baumfree from birth, Sojourner Truth was born around the year 1797, with the exact date being unknown. This is a result of Truth's date of birth not being recorded, which was typical of children that were born into slavery. Young Isabella was born into slavery in Swarterkill, New York, as the 10th of 12 children. Her father James was a slave captured in modern-day Ghana, and her mother was a daughter of slaves from Guinea. The Baumfree family was owned by Colonel Hardenberg, who bought Truth's parents from slave traders and kept them and their family at his estate in Swarterkill, New York. When Colonel Hardenberg died in 1806, 9-year-old Truth was sold at an auction to John Neely near Kingston, New York. It was until that time that Truth only spoke Dutch as a result of Swarterkill, New York, being Dutch-owned. John Neely was described as cruel and violent, with Truth later explaining how he beat her daily. In 1808, Neely sold her for $105 to a tavern keeper named Martin Shriver of Port Ewan, New York. Yet after only 18 months with Martinus, he sold Truth in 1810 to John Dumont of West Park, New York. Truth would go on to spend the majority of her adolescence with the sexually abusive Dumont and his second wife. The years she lived enslaved to Dumont were extremely unpleasant. The constant sexual abuse that Truth endured at the hands of Dumont created significant levels of tension between Truth and Dumont's wife, who made her life even more miserable than it already was. In 1815, with Truth aged around 18, she fell in love with an enslaved man named Robert from a neighbouring farm. However, Robert's owner forbade her relationship with him as he did not want Robert to have children with Truth. This is because Robert's owner did not own Truth, and therefore, he would not own any children she birthed. Despite the warnings from Robert's owner, he kept secretly meeting up with Truth. However, one fateful day, Robert's owner found the couple together and went on to violently beat him. The violence only stopped when Dumont intervened. Sadly, after that day, Truth never saw Robert again. What exactly happened to him after the incident is unknown, but it's thought that he died a few years after. This traumatic experience was said to have haunted Truth for the rest of her days. While Truth was young, she gave birth to 2 children, James and Diana. Unfortunately, James died while still a child. Meanwhile, Diana, who was born in 1815, was the result of her slave owner forcing himself on her. Around 2 years later, Dumont forced Truth to marry an older enslaved man named Thomas, whom she bore 3 children with, Peter, Elizabeth, and Sophia. In 1799, the state of New York started to legislate the abolition of slavery. Despite this, the true emancipation of those people enslaved in New York was not complete until July 4th, 1827. At this point, Truth's slave owner had promised to grant her freedom a year before the state emancipation in 1826, but only if she was doing well and was faithful. Despite this, Dumont decided against this and claimed that a hand injury sustained by Truth made her less productive. Now nearing 30 years old, Truth was angered by this, yet for now she had no other choice than to continue working away. In late 1826, Truth managed to successfully escape to freedom with her small daughter, Sophia. However, she was forced to leave her other children behind, as they were still bound to their owners and would not be legally freed in the Emancipation Order of 1827. Not long after achieving this newfound freedom, Truth learned that her 5-year-old son Peter had been illegally sold by Dumont to a fellow slave owner in Alabama and was being severely abused by the people that were enslaving him. She took this issue to court, and in 1828, after several months of legal proceedings, she eventually managed to get her son rightfully returned to her. In taking this issue to court, Sojourner Truth became one of the first black women to go to court against a white man and win. Looking to finally begin a better life, Truth moved with her son Peter to New York City in 1829, where she worked as a housekeeper for Elijah Pearson, a Christian evangelist. Then, in 1832, she met Robert Matthews and went to work with him as a housekeeper at the Matthews Kingdom Communal Colony. While working for Matthews, Truth's son Peter took a job on a whaling ship in 1839 and Truth received letters from him between 1840 and 1841. Finally, in 1842, the ship docked in Nantucket's harbour, and Truth was excited to reunite with her son. However, Peter was nowhere to be found. What exactly happened to him is unknown. All we can be certain of is that Truth would never hear from her son again. Since adolescence, Truth claimed that she had visions and heard voices. She attributed these experiences to being communications from God. In 1843, Truth became a Methodist and changed her name. Up until this point of her life, she was known as Isabella Bauntfree, but from this point onwards, she would famously be known as Sojourner Truth. According to Truth, she chose each part of this name specifically. Sojourner, because she had to travel up and down the land showing people their sins and being assigned to them, and Truth, because the Spirit of God spoke to her, telling her to preach the truth. She mentioned this to her close friends and acquaintances, saying, "The Spirit calls me, and I must go." Shortly after, Truth left New York City, making her way to Massachusetts. She did this in order to campaign for the abolition of slavery and to make her voice heard all over the eastern part of the US. Following this, Truth started to attend Millerite camp meetings. This group followed the teachings of the American Baptist preacher William Miller, who predicted and preached that the return of Jesus was close. According to Miller, he would return between the years 1843 and 1844, consequently ending life on earth. Truth found great appreciation in these circles, drawing large crowds whenever she spoke, preached, or sang. However, like many others, Truth distanced herself from her Millerite network after Jesus' second coming never occurred. After leaving the Millerites behind her, in 1844, Truth became a part of an abolitionist-founded group called the Northampton Association of Education and Industry. This organization was very forward-thinking, supporting women's rights, religious tolerance, and even pacifism. Truth had similar beliefs to many fellow members, and thanks to the support from this group, she successfully delivered her very first anti-slavery speech. This marked the beginning of her life as an activist. As time passed, Truth continued to work and speak in public. In 1850, she saved enough money to purchase a house in Florence, Massachusetts. That same year, she was invited to speak at the first National Women's Rights Convention, which was held in Worcester, Massachusetts. As time passed, Truth's reputation grew in abolitionist circles, and by 1851, she was giving lectures throughout New York State, along with the abolitionist and speaker, George Thompson. Yet, it wasn't until a few months later that she rose to true prominence. The moment that acquired her such fame happened in May, where Truth attended the Ohio Women's Rights Convention and delivered her most famous speech on women's rights, later to be known as "Ain't I a Woman?" This speech demanded equal human rights for all women, as well as for African Americans. It is said that Truth took the stage with a demanding and composed presence, with audience members being perplexed by the way she carried herself and were hesitant to believe that she was even a woman, prompting the name of her speech. The first version of the speech was published a month later by Marius Robinson, an editor of the Ohio newspaper, the Anti-Slavery Bugle. Robinson attended the convention and recorded Truth's words for himself. However, the speech did not include the question, "Ain't I a woman?" not even once. The famous phrase, however, would appear 12 years later with a southern-tinged version of the speech. However, it is extremely unlikely that Truth, a native of New York, whose first language was Dutch, would have spoken in this southern idiom. Truth's views were considered radical, even in abolitionist circles. She sought political equality for all women and reprimanded the abolitionist community for failing to seek civil rights for black women, as well as men. On top of this, she voiced her concern, stating that it's possible that the movement would dissolve after achieving victories for black men, leaving both white and black women without suffrage and other key political rights. These views at this time show what an important figure Truth was, and still is, within both the civil rights and feminist movements. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, and until its conclusion, Truth aided the Union cause by recruiting African American troops for its army. In 1864, she was hired by the National Freedmen's Relief Association in Washington, D.C. Truth worked very hard within the association, trying her very best to improve conditions for African Americans. In October of that same year, she even met with President Abraham Lincoln to discuss these matters. Even after the war, Truth was not finished. She turned her attention to battling new problems such as racial segregation on public transport, the poverty of Southern African American refugees, and general unemployment and land shortages among African Americans. Her smart exploitation of her reputation through photography and print helped her to become one of the most renowned orators of the century. In 1870, Truth was invited to the White House, where she had a meeting with the President Grant. 2 years later, she was back in Battle Creek, Michigan, and became an active member of Grant's presidential re-election campaign. Truth even went to the polling station on election day, trying to vote and further make her voice heard, but being a woman, she was turned away. Even towards the end of her life, not everyone welcomed Truth's preaching and lectures. However, she had good friends and very good connections to influential people at the time. Nearing the end of her life, Truth grew weak and ill and was looked after by 2 of her daughters. Sojourner Truth died on the 26th of November, 1883, at the age of 86 at her home in Battle Creek. Her funeral was held just 2 days later at the Congregational Presbyterian Church with nearly 1,000 people in attendance. She was then buried in the city's Oak Hill Cemetery. African American social reformer Frederick Douglass offered a eulogy for her in Washington, D.C., which compiled her achievements and impact beautifully. Venerable for age, distinguished for insight into human nature, remarkable for independence and courageous self-assertion, devoted to the welfare of her race, she has been for the last 40 years an object of respect and admiration to social reformers everywhere. To commemorate Sojourner Truth's life and work, many memorials have been erected in her name. These include plaques, monuments and statues in many US states, including Michigan, Ohio, New York, California, and Washington, D.C. As well as this, many works of art have been inspired by Truth and her life. In 1862, American sculptor William Wetmore completed a marble statue named the Libyan Sibyl. The work won an award at the London World Exhibition. In 1892, artist Frank Corter was commissioned by Francis Titus to paint the meeting between Truth and President Abraham Lincoln that occurred on October 29, 1864. In 1945, Elizabeth Catlett created a print entitled I'm Sojourner Truth as part of a series honouring the labour of black women. The print can be located in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection. She would later create a full-size statue of Truth, which was displayed in Sacramento, California. In the United States, and even around the world, it's widely acknowledged that Truth left behind a legacy of courage, faith, and fighting for what's right and honourable. Without a doubt, Truth's life and the impact that she left behind can still be seen today.
Next, we are heading to 19th century Tennessee, where a relatively unknown Western legend was born. Mary Fields was born in Hickman County, Tennessee, in 1832. She worked in the cotton fields as a slave for the first 30 years of her life. As with most slaves, information on her early life is virtually non-existent. Because of this, we can only assume what her living conditions were like. All we know is that Mary must have outgrown most boys and girls in her town. By the time she was 18, she was a towering figure, standing at 6 feet tall and weighing around 200 pounds. At that time, it was common that their owners never recorded their names in documents. Instead, they used numbers which were written down in books. Slaves were treated like pieces of property, and Mary Fields was probably no exception. In 1865, the American Civil War came to an end, and with it, slavery was outlawed. Finally, Mary was freed after having been a slave for over 30 years of her life. Unsure what to do, she followed the same path as many other former slaves and headed to a new life in the much friendlier North. Eventually, she found work as a laundress and servant on Mississippi River steamboats. After this, she supposedly worked in San Antonio, Florida, in the home of the judge, Edmund Dunn. However, when Dunn's wife, Josephine, died, he asked Mary to take his 5 children to their aunt in Ohio. After a long journey, they finally reached the Ursuline Convent of the Sacred Heart in Toledo, of which the children's aunt, Mary Amadeus Dunn, was the Mother Superior. Mary had successfully fulfilled her duty. The 5 children were now safely under their aunt's care. When the nuns asked Mary how her journey was, she replied that it was fine, and then stated that she could really do with a cigar and a drink. With Edmund Dunn in Florida, and the children safely under the protection of their aunt, Mary no longer had an employer. Fortunately, the convent immediately hired her as a groundskeeper. Yet, the poor nuns had no idea what they were getting into. The nuns of the convent were very peaceful and well disciplined. Mary was the complete opposite. For the next 15 years, Mary worked at the convent. While there, she received lodgings, meals, clothing, and was paid $50 per year. The previously calm and orderly convent completely changed when Mary arrived. She was loud and expressed herself in any way she saw fit. This raised many eyebrows in the quiet convent. It's true that she did her job well and kept the grounds in immaculate shape, but her behaviour intimidated many of the nuns. As one nun recalled, "God help anyone who walked on the lawn after Mary had cut it. She swore, complained about her low pay, and would fight anyone, man or woman, at any given moment." This behaviour would have shocked white women at the time. They expected African Americans to be well behaved and subservient, yet Mary didn't fit into this norm. Also, there are records that many nuns complained about her temper and difficult nature. Although Mary initially struggled to adjust to the calm life of the convent, she did make one important friend, Mother Amadeus Dunn, the convent's highly respected and much adored Mother Superior. Mother Amadeus was a brave soul, known for her charisma and fearlessness. She got on very well with Mary, and their friendship blossomed. In 1884, she was called to do missionary work by her bishop and was sent to Montana Territory to establish schools for Native American children. A year later, Mother Amadeus fell very ill, possibly due to pneumonia. Despite all of Mary's flaws, she had a strong sense of loyalty and a heart of gold. As soon as she heard the news that her friend was ill, she dropped everything and endured a 1,600-mile trip by herself to rush to her side in Cascade, Montana. Mary stayed with Mother Amadeus until she was fully recovered, and she was vital in nursing her back to health. Initially, Mary planned on returning to the convent in Ohio, once her dear friend was better. However, she decided that she liked the West and decided to stay there. Following this, Mary started to work at a Montana convent near Cascade. For several years, she helped to build churches and other buildings surrounding the convent. She was an effective worker and refused men's help while carrying heavy loads of lumber and stone on her back. Once the construction was complete, she continued to work for the convent, but now she had a much more direct relationship with the nuns. Although she faithfully served the nuns in the harsh, isolated community, her attitude and actions made the bishop grow increasingly concerned. Only a few months passed, and already several people had complained to the bishop about her behaviour. Not only did his new employee smoke, drink, and swear, but she also dressed like a man. These values, which were not at all in line with the Catholic churches, caused tensions. The final straw came when Mary got into an argument with the convent's disrespectful janitor. Things turned violent, and both drew guns on each other. After this, the bishop ordered her to leave the convent and never return. This was the first time after many years that Mary was finally free to think about what she wanted to do. But first, she had to make ends meet. To provide for herself, she did all sorts of odd jobs, such as working on a farm growing crops, looking after animals, doing people's laundry, and even repairing buildings. It was around this time that the Native Americans nicknamed her White Crow. Apparently, this was because she acted like a white woman, but had black skin. As she was the first and one of the only African Americans in the town, local whites didn't know what to think of her. In an essay, a schoolgirl wrote this of Mary: "She drinks whiskey and she swears, and she is a Republican, which makes her a low, foul creature." Yet with the pass of time, opinions on her within the town changed. She ended up opening a restaurant and decided to serve food to anyone, regardless if they had the money to pay or not. Unfortunately, her tendency to give free meals to the needy put her out of business. After just 10 months, her restaurant closed down due to bankruptcy. It was around this time that she could frequently be found in saloons, drinking strong liquors and getting into gunfights. In 1895, her old friend, Mother Amadeus, donated a stagecoach to encourage travel in the remote region. This also meant that the US Post Office could use it to open a star route for faster mail delivery. Although Mary was around 63 years old, she was hired by the US Postal Service as a mail courier. Despite the competition, Mary won the sought-after position thanks to her tough reputation and by hitching horses in the harness faster than the other applicants, who were all men around half her age. She was the second woman and first African American to work as a star route carrier. It was no easy job. She was in charge of safely delivering and protecting mail from thieves and bandits. She would receive the mail from certain trains, load it into a stagecoach, and maneuver her way around all sorts of terrain, from rough roads to muddy fields. She quickly established a reputation for reliability. She never missed a day of work, and thanks to this, she earned the nickname Stagecoach Mary. She expertly handled her team of several horses and a mule named Moses. When her route was affected by heavy snow, making the horses unable to move properly, she would strap on her snowshoes, throw the mailbags over her shoulders, and walk into town. Despite her intimidating height, size, tough demeanor, and reputation, some still thought they could get the better of her. Mary carried with her a rifle and revolver, so that any troublemakers could be quickly dealt with by a single, well-placed bullet. Rumour had it that she managed to fend off an angry pack of wolves with her rifle. This may well be true, as we know she was a very effective shooter. Her temperament was compared to that of a grizzly bear. Stagecoach Mary was not to be crossed under any circumstances. Yet, many fools did so anyway. In one case, a man seriously offended Mary. She responded by pelting him with rocks until he cried. Another instance where she was crossed was when a cowboy challenged her to a duel. She accepted. When the duel began, she was so fast at pulling out her six-shooter that her opponent didn't stand a chance. Mary purposely shot close to his head so that he could feel the wind of the bullet. Frightened, the man immediately conceded and never spoke to her again. Stagecoach Mary became a respected and beloved celebrity in Cascade. Although she was strong and intimidating, the locals admired her generosity and kindness to children. Moreover, the town's schools closed each year on her birthday to celebrate her life and special day. Thanks to her fame, local restaurants would give her free meals, and in saloons, everyone would want to talk to her. Unfortunately, Montana passed a law forbidding women from entering saloons. Mary was no longer allowed to drink in one of her favourite places. But the mayor of Cascade granted her an exemption. Besides, nobody was brave enough to try and keep her out. In 1903, at 71 years old, age finally caught up to her. After 8 years of doing her duty, Mary Fields retired from the Star Route mail carrier service. For the remainder of her life, she dedicated herself to babysit Cascade children and operated a laundry service from her home. Mary Fields died of liver failure on the 5th of December 1914 at Columbus Hospital in Great Falls at the age of 82. After her death, the whole town mourned. Her passing signalled the end of an era. The West was full of strong and courageous people, but none of them were like Stagecoach Mary. Many legends from the Wild West have had their stories exaggerated, with fiction mixing with fact. But this wasn't necessary for Stagecoach Mary. She was described as one of the freest souls to ever draw breath. Mary Fields was buried outside of Cascade. Her funeral was one of the largest the town had ever seen.
For our final story, we are going back to early 20th century Missouri.
Freda Josephine McDonald was born on the 3rd of June 1906 in St. Louis, Missouri. Her father, Eddie Carson, was a vaudeville drummer, yet shortly after Josephine's birth, he abandoned her along with Josephine's mother, called Carrie McDonald. With her left alone to raise a child, she had to give up her dream of becoming a music-hall dancer and worked as a washerwoman. Carrie soon met a kind man called Arthur Martin, and the couple got married. The family grew as Carrie gave birth to a son and 2 more daughters, but this meant they had more mouths to feed, and Martin was always unemployed. The family had very little money. Josephine grew up in a low-income neighbourhood, consisting mainly of rooming houses, brothels, and apartments without indoor plumbing. As a child, she was dressed poorly and was frequently hungry, but she did develop a lot of street smarts. Due to her parents struggling to provide for the whole family, she grew up cleaning houses and babysitting for wealthy white families. Supposedly, she started working around the age of 8 in order to support her family and younger siblings. She was often treated poorly, and while babysitting, the families reminded her to not kiss the baby. On one occasion, a woman burnt her hands because she put too much soap in the laundry. As she spent most of her days working, she didn't receive an education after the age of 8. Nevertheless, at around 11 years old, she returned to school, albeit only for 2 years. Then, when she was 13, she ran away from home and got a job waitressing at the old Chauffeurs Club. For a while, she lived in the slums of St. Louis, having to sleep in cardboard shelters and scavenge rubbish bins for food. While working there, she met, and shortly after married, a man named Willie Wells. Despite her being young, Josephine made sure to be always financially independent, something unusual for a woman of her era. Weeks after the marriage, the relationship started to go downhill. Being independent, she didn't hesitate in leaving Willie Wells, despite how tough it could have been for her. It was around this time that Josephine first took up dancing, following the dream that her mother once had. She took after her talents and honed her skills in street performances and clubs. Within months, she was touring the States with the Jones Family Band and the Dixie Steppers, performing a variety of comical skits, and she was only 13. In 1921, Josephine got married for the second time. On this occasion, to a man named Willie Baker. Years later, they divorced, but she decided to keep his last name for the rest of her life. Eventually, she auditioned as a chorus girl for the Dixie Steppers and Blake's production, Shuffle Along. However, she was rejected. The organizer said it was because she was too skinny and too dark. In spite of that, she decided to learn the chorus lines and routines anyway, although it was a lot of hard work, rehearsing, as well as working. In 1923, her decision paid off. Josephine landed a role in the musical Shuffle Along as a member of the chorus. While on stage, she rolled her eyes and purposely acted clumsy. It was this comedic touch that made her loved by the audiences. Looking to increase her name in showbiz, she moved to New York City in 1924, where she landed roles on Broadway. First, she performed in the Chocolate Dandies, and then at the Plantation Club, alongside other stars such as Ethel Waters. Again, she was a crowd favourite and grew a good reputation. In 1925, Josephine travelled to Paris to perform in La Revue Nègre at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées. While in Paris, her career thrived. She attracted thousands to her shows, and this was helped by the fact that the French public was obsessed with American jazz, as well as all things exotic. In one particular performance, called the Danse Sauvage, in which she only wore a feather skirt, the French audiences were always blown away. During this time, Josephine took steps to tackle racism and discrimination that existed in Europe. To do this, she demanded that her contract contain a non-discrimination clause. This meant that her audiences should be integrated by all people, regardless of race. Although it was only a small step, she would go on to advocate for equal rights on a much larger scale. When La Revue Nègre closed, Josephine starred in various shows at the renowned Folies Bergère music hall. It was here that her erotic dancing allowed her to reach true stardom. Her most famous show was called La Folie du Jour, and each time she delivered a jaw-dropping performance. What stood out from other shows was her costume. She would dance wearing a piece made of 16 bananas strung to a skirt. By 1927, Josephine was one of the highest paid performers in Europe. Her talent gained her the admiration of huge cultural figures such as Pablo Picasso, Ernest Hemingway, and E.E. Cummings. Hemingway said this about her: "She was the most sensational woman anyone ever saw." Furthermore, she rivaled famous film stars of the day like Gloria Swanson and Mary Pickford as the most photographed woman in the world. Her celebrity status led to a series of nicknames, including Black Venus and Black Pearl. Supposedly, while at the peak of her career, she received over 1,000 marriage proposals. Following this success, she landed roles in 2 films. In 1934, she starred in Zuzu, and a year later, in Princess Tam Tam. With her savings from performances and the money she earned as an actress, she purchased a lovely estate which she named Les Milandes, located in the ancient town of Castelnaud-Fayrac in the southwest of France. With her considerable wealth, she paid for her whole family to move to the estate with her, leaving behind their home in St. Louis, Missouri. In 1936, Josephine returned to the United States to star in the Ziegfeld Follier. Although she had found huge success in Europe, she hoped to become a big name in her home country. Yet, this proved disastrous. The American audiences were very hostile, and it seemed that the reason for this was the color of her skin. The racist reaction, not only from crowds, but also from the papers, left her heartbroken. She was soon back in France, and in 1937, Josephine got married for the 3rd time, on this occasion to a French industrialist called Jean Léon. Josephine had now been in France for over 10 years, and although her marriage to Jean Léon only lasted a year, it was enough for her to obtain French citizenship. With the outbreak of World War II, Josephine started to work for the Red Cross. She also attended various events and parties with high-ranking officials from different countries. At these events, she would mingle and use her charm to collect information on the location of German troops. With the occupation of France, she became a member of the Free French Forces. Also, during the 1940s, she travelled to North Africa and various French colonies. On her tours, she kept morale high, entertaining troops by dancing and singing. However, it was while collaborating with the French resistance that she did her most important work. Acting undercover, she smuggled secret messages hidden in her music sheets and even in her underwear. It was also around this time that she had the last of several miscarriages. Because of this, she had to undergo an operation and even developed a nasty infection. After recovering, she continued to entertain soldiers and smuggle messages. For these efforts, she was awarded France's highest military honours, including la Croix de Guerre, la Rosette de la Résistance, and la Légion d'honneur. After the war, Josephine spent various years at her estate. During this time, she married Joe Bouillon, a French orchestra leader. During the 1950s and 60s, Josephine returned to the United States to fight racism and support the civil rights movement. She participated in demonstrations, boycotted segregated clubs, concert venues, and even used her influence to bring to light all the ongoing problems in the States. One time, while in New York with her husband, they were refused reservations at 36 hotels because of racial discrimination. Josephine was so upset by this treatment that she wrote articles about the segregation in the United States. Josephine also criticized various clubs' unwritten policy of discouraging black patrons. She also then scolded an old ally and columnist, Walter Winchell, for not rising to her defense. Winchell responded by criticizing her and even accused her of being a communist sympathizer, which was a serious charge at the time. This resulted in the termination of Josephine's work visa. She had no choice but to return to France, and it was almost a decade until she was allowed back in to her home country. In honor of her efforts, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People named the 20th of May Josephine Baker Day. In 1963, she participated in the March on Washington and was one of the many notable people that spoke out to the huge crowd. One part of her speech that stood out was when she said, "I have walked into the palaces of kings and queens and into the houses of presidents, and much more, but I could not walk into a hotel in America and get a cup of coffee, and that made me mad. And when I get mad, you know that I open my big mouth, and then look out, 'cause when Josephine opens her mouth, they hear it all over the world." A few years prior, she had begun to adopt babies from around the world. In total, she adopted 12 children. She referred to her large family as the Rainbow Tribe. Josephine did this in part to prove that children of different ethnicities and religions could still be brothers. Visitors would often come to the estate and see that what she claimed was more than true. The children were happy and lived together in harmony. In January 1966, Josephine performed at the Teatro Musical de La Habana in Cuba. Fidel Castro had invited her personally to celebrate the 7-year anniversary of his revolution. Her spectacular show broke attendance records. 2 years later, Baker lost her chateau due to unpaid debts. This made front-page news. She had to be forcibly removed from the premises because she wouldn't let it go. Fortunately, her friend, Princess Grace of Monaco, financed an apartment for her and the children to live in. As time passed, Josephine continued to travel back and forth from France to the United States. On one visit, she began a liaison with an American artist called Robert Brady. At this point in her life, Josephine, more than anything, was looking for a platonic relationship. Fortunately, Brady felt the same. As she was now divorced from her fourth husband, Joe Bullion, she was free to spend time with Brady. In September 1973, the pair traveled to Acapulco, Mexico. While there, they exchanged marriage vows in an empty church. Although legally they weren't married, as no one was present, it was important for the bond that they shared. Josephine kept the events in Acapulco quite secretive, as she believed the press would ridicule it if they ever found out. Later that year, Josephine agreed to perform at Carnegie Hall in New York. Before the show began, she was nervous due to her previously bad experiences while performing in the States. Yet this time, she was greeted with a standing ovation. Her reception was so touching that she wept on stage in front of her audience. In April 1975, at the age of 68, Josephine premiered at the Bobino Theatre in Paris. It was the first of a series of performances to celebrate the 50th anniversary of her Paris debut. At the show, Josephine performed a variety of routines from her long and successful career. The reviews she received were some of her best ever. However, just days later, on the 12th of April 1975, Josephine Baker fell into a coma and died from a cerebral hemorrhage. On the day of her funeral, over 20,000 people lined the streets of Paris to witness the procession. Furthermore, the French government honoured her with a 21-gun salute. This made Josephine the first American woman in history to be buried in France with military honours. In 1991, a movie based on her life was released, called The Josephine Baker Story. The film won 5 Emmy Awards and a Golden Globe.
Thank you so much everyone for watching this video, and if you watched it the whole way through and made it to the end, an extra special thanks to you. I hope you guys enjoyed the stories and found them interesting. If you have any suggestions, be sure to let me know down below in the comments. And I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.